What is Catholic social thought? Imagine you're taking a walk in the park when you come across a group of people having an argument. Apparently, they're arguing about someone named John. Now, you've never heard of this John, and it doesn't look like he's one of the people in the group. Poor John, it seems, is not a well-loved man. But the more you listen to the argument, the more the criticisms leveled against John begin to strike you as strange. For the group is arguing about whether John is tall. And it's not even as if one side is arguing that he is, and the other side is arguing that he isn't. Half of the group is insisting that John is too tall, while the other half is insisting that John is too short. At this point, you do what any reasonable person would do in a situation like this, at least short of walking away. You start to pay attention to who's making the arguments, rather than to the arguments they're making. And that's when you notice something suspicious. Everyone who's arguing that John is too tall is noticeably shorter than average. Everyone who's arguing that John is too short is noticeably taller than average. There isn't a single person of average height in the group. G.K. Chesterton once used a story like this as a way to introduce the person of Jesus Christ. To some, he's too tall. To others, he's too short. To some, he's too lenient. To others, he's too demanding. To some, he's too human. To others, he's too divine. But to those with faith, Jesus Christ is perfectly human and perfectly divine, perfectly lenient and perfectly demanding. He is, as it were, just the right height. The criticisms of Christ tell us far more about the critics than about the subject of their criticism. Chesterton's clever approach to Jesus also provides a perfect approach to Catholic social thought. For just as in the cases of John and Jesus, so too in the case of the social teaching of the Catholic Church, do we find it subject to a cadre of contrary criticisms. In the estimation of some of these critics, both inside and outside the Church, Catholic social thought is simply too conservative, too traditional, too behind the times to be defensible or credible in our modern world. In the estimation of other critics, however, Catholic social thought is simply too liberal, too progressive, too much of a concession to modernity to be a legitimate development of the deposit of faith handed down from the apostles. Now, it's one thing to say that Catholic social thought is neither too reactionary nor too concessionary, neither too traditional nor too progressive, neither too conservative nor too liberal. But it's a very different thing to say what Catholic social thought actually is. So, what is it? To answer that question, I want to start with an insight drawn from ancient Greek philosophy. Today, we are much more likely to associate politics and the political aspects of human life with immorality than with morality, with pragmatic wheeling and dealing than with interpersonal thriving, with self-interested manipulation than with selfless care for the common good. But from the beginning, this was not so. In the earliest days of philosophical reflection on the topic, politics was actually seen as a branch of ethics. The idea was this: ethics is the study of happiness or human flourishing. But if the only sort of happiness we study is our happiness as individuals, if the only sort of flourishing we investigate is our personal flourishing, then our study of happiness, our investigation of flourishing, will be incomplete. For we also flourish interpersonally. We also find our happiness in relation to others. Politics, then, is the study of and search for our happiness as members of civil society, our flourishing in its fullest and most expansive sense. But we can think about this ethical conception of politics in two ways, from the top down or from the bottom up. When we think about what it is for us to flourish as members of civil society from the top down, we will be focused on how the leaders of civil society ought to exercise their authority. When we think about what it is for us to flourish as members of civil society from the bottom up, however, we will be focused on how the members of civil society ought to live within it, on things like how the laws and the intentions behind them ought to be respected, on the ways in which citizens should live and work together, and on what they owe to the community as a whole. This bottom-up approach to politics is what we call social ethics. And when theology builds up and elevates this branch of moral philosophy in the light of revelation and with the aid of the deposit of faith, what we get is Catholic social thought. In other words, Catholic social thought is nothing more and nothing less than the part of moral theology that studies how the grace of Jesus Christ transforms, perfects, elevates, and divinizes how we flourish as members of society from the bottom up. This cannot rightly be described as either too traditional or too progressive, too conservative or too liberal, for the truth is always just right. Rather, we should think of Catholic social thought as being paradigmatically ever ancient, ever new, to borrow the phrase from St. Augustine. For whenever society changes, the details of how grace empowers us to flourish in that society also change. But what it is for us to flourish in society under grace never changes. This video series on Catholic social thought will provide you with both the unchanging principles of social theology and their novel application in our contemporary world. And I hope it will help keep you out of useless arguments.
In the next episode, we'll speed through nearly 2,000 years of history and see how the so-called Dark Ages would be better called the Light Ages, a deeply fruitful time for thinking about social ethics. If this is the first episode you've watched, we recommend you watch the introductory episode of this series next.